morning, everyone, and Assalamualaikum. Thank you very much, Malaysian Institute of Accountants and ICAEW for having me here. It's really a pleasure. So anyway, just a bit about myself. I've been in PwC for 18 years, just like the MC mentioned earlier. And right now, I'm a partner in PwC. I do a lot of advisory work, a broad range of advisory work from risk governance and also ESG. And basically, my role is about helping our clients adopt or adapt to ESG rules and strengthen their ESG framework and activities. So the first statement that I want to make is the topic of ESG, and in particular climate change, is not going away. It's going to be with us for a long time. It's been embedded into our regulations, so it's not going away. And I think the reason why this statement is important is because sometimes there are some views that ESG is probably just a fad, a trend, something that people do just to make something looks good, if you will. I'm here to prove that it's not. Subtext, I'm not here to preach. I'm not here to take a moral high ground, the fact that we need to protect our environment and so on. I think all of us are on the same page there. But I'm here to highlight in what way the landscape of ESG and sustainability has changed, and in what way it will impact the students and therefore the education sector. That is my mission today, right? So that was my first statement. ESG is not going away. Specifically, climate change is not going away. My statement number two is, because of the confluence of public awareness, regulation, government policy, stakeholders, institutional investors, this whole concept is transforming our economy in a big way, not just in Malaysia, but around the world. Later in my presentation, I will talk about the Malaysian policy in terms of Malaysian National Plan, in terms of National Energy Transition Roadmap. But to put things simply, our whole economy is decarbonizing. What does it mean? It means that by 2050, our country's strategy is 70% of our energy will be renewable. And when we talk about renewable energy, this is not just about having solar panels, a lot of solar panels now and more solar panels in the future. We are talking about the energy grid. We are talking about how those energy are stored. We are talking about the electrification of our transportation system. We are talking about the accountants having to be familiar with sustainability rules. We are talking about architects and engineers having to be familiar with green buildings. We are talking about lawyers. We are talking about all the other professions. Everyone is going to be impacted by this. Why? Because our economy and our industry are facing a new paradigm shift. It's changing, right? That's my statement number two. My statement number three is, because of these changes, there are risks, career risks and opportunities to people. Career opportunities mean that any accounting graduates who are able to go to an interview and say that not only I understand IFRS, but I also understand not only I understand IFRS accounting standards, but I also understand IFRS sustainability standards, is likely to have an advantage in the job market. Any accounting graduates that say that, in addition to that, I also understand greenhouse gas protocol, and I understand what are the parameters that people use to measure greenhouse gases, and I understand how to decarbonize it, will have even stronger advantage. And you repeat this across all the other profession, architects, engineers, lawyers, and the rest of it. So there is a big career opportunities, but also career risks. Career risks in terms of those professions or those accountants which do choose not to adapt and choose not to be aware of these new regulations and standards will find themselves disadvantaged. It's as simple as that. That's my statement number 3. And my last statement, statement number 4, is therefore, the education sector is in a great place right now because you are now in a position to influence the next generation of minds. Because of what's changing, what's happening in the future, the importance on the education sector is become even more, it's always been important, but even more important now, right? So just to summarize, basically that's it. I believe to finish already my presentation slides. Basically, ESG is not going away. It's changing our industry and economy in a big way. It presents a big career risks and opportunities, and therefore education sector is important. Okay, so now, I hope I have the right slide. Sekali tengok slide yang salah, cakap benda lain. Then it's going to be very awkward. But let's go through the 20 slides just to back up what I mentioned. So first, simply, what's the difference between ESG and sustainability? Same, but a bit different. But generally, there are many definitions of sustainability, but the best one that I could find was from United Nations. But basically, it talks about meeting the needs of today without compromising the needs of future generation, right? So that's sustainability. And ESG is simply an acronym. E stands for environment, S for social, G for governance, which I'm sure many of us already aware. So they are quite similar in certain ways. What's different is the context, how the words are used. Typically, when people use the word sustainability, they say, I want to have a sustainable business model. I want to have a sustainable organization. I want to have a sustainable direction. You know, it talks about that kind of context, mission, objective, purpose. Whereas ESG is more about, okay, I want to have a sustainable direction or sustainable business model. Have we considered the environment factor? Have we considered the social factor? Have we considered the governance factors, right? So, in a simple way, that's the way that I look at it. In principle, it's the same thing, but the context is a bit different. Okay, in this particular slide, it's one of the most important part because one of the most tricky question to answer is when a company comes or when a student comes and say, I want to learn about ESG, or a company say, I want to become more ESG. How do I become more ESG? How do I learn ESG, right? And this is where the question becomes tricky because in my mind, the question that comes back is, well, which part of ESG are we talking about? Because within the context of environment, there is the context of emission and global warming. There is a subject of energy management. There is a subject of water management, biodiversity, and waste management, and many more. Each of that is a distinctive discipline because each of that relate to a different issue and different strategy. In the context of S, well, there is a community engagement, there is labor rights, there is health and safety, there is training awareness, and many more. In the context of G, there is policy and procedures, there's board structure, there's anti-corruption, there's ethics, integrity, and so on. So when you think about it, ESG is pretty much everything. So therefore, if we reframe the question, I want to learn about ESG, it's almost like I want to learn about everything from a certain perspective. So therefore, I think this particular information is important because there are a lot of nuances within the topic of ESG. So when people talk about net zero, when people talk about global warming, when people talk about greenhouse gas, those relate to climate change part of ESG under the environment. When people talk about labor rights, health and safety, when people talk about how some Malaysian companies had their contracts taken away by their international customer because they were perceived as breaking health and safety rules or labor rules, that's under the social part, right? And many more. So this part is very important, and if you are a bit of a geek like me, and I like to read annual report or sustainability statement before I go to sleep, you will notice that in many of the sustainability statements, they have a lot of references to say these are the different parts of ESG that we are doing. So they don't say we do everything ESG. They actually define it, right? So there is that's my key message. There are nuances on ESG. There are also these colorful things that you sometimes see in many annual reports. These are called UN SDG, or United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So a bit of history behind the UN SDG. So the United Nations, they were trying to codify what exactly sustainability mean in terms of objective. They were wondering, does sustainability means justice? Does it mean that no more poor people? Does it mean that clean energy? What is it? So they came up with these 17 goals. And these 17 goals are very broad. It's also very diverse. So you can see there is things such as no hunger, no poverty, strong peace, justice, and strong institutions. It talks about life below water, life on land. So without going through each one of them, you can tell that there are also elements of E, S, and G there. Some part of it relate to nature, E. Some part of it relate to S, social, no poverty, no hunger. Some part of it relate to governance, such as strong institutions. Right? So this is another framework which is very useful, especially in people of my profession, because we advise our clients how to direct their ESG strategy. And this is very, very useful indeed. Okay, apologies for the small for the small words in there. But basically, what this slide is showing is there is this particular publication, World Economic Forum, and what they do is they send out a lot of surveys to the industry leaders, CEOs, and so on, and they ask from those survey respondents, thousands of them, these are key leaders around the world, what are the key long-term risks that they anticipate? And as you can see, they do this every year. And for 2024, the top one, apologies if you cannot read it at the back, is extreme weather events, critical change to Earth system, biodiversity loss, national resource shortage. Those are those in the yellow. And in the gray is misinformation and disinformation. So basically, the yellow generally relates to environmental factors, and the gray refers to social and governance factors, right? But basically, you can see, if you ask the global leaders, the CEOs, the policymakers around the world, and if you ask them a question, what are the key long-term risks that's affecting the society and the world, a lot of environmental issue comes out. Not because of anything, but because if you look at it from the economic perspective, a lot of our economy and therefore job market and therefore career opportunities and therefore the community are dependent on nature. We cannot run away from it. So for example, if we look in Malaysia, palm oil sector contributes a significant part of our GDP. And a significant number of employment in our country, not just those large GLCs, but also the supply chain, the vendors, and so on. And if we look at other parts of agriculture, for example, a lot of them are highly sensitive to weather conditions, to climate risks, to droughts. I have a lot of clients and friends in the palm oil sector. I mean, I'm not agriculture expert by profession. I mean, I'm just an accountant. But in a lot of my conversation, I learn a lot of fascinating stuff about how plantations and how trees work. So the thing about palm oil, I realize, is they're actually a bit manja. Yes, they can tahan a bit of droughts and lack of rain, but not too long. Yes, they can tolerate water, but not too much water. And when we talk about climate risk, it's not just about when things are flooded, you cannot send the tractors there to extract the fruits, but it's also about the productivity of those trees itself. And this can be applied to any other agricultural products, such as rice and wheat and rubber and so on. So the point is, our economy is highly exposed to nature and climate risks, whether we realize it or not. The impacts of climate change in Malaysia, I was very shocked and concerned when I learned about these particular facts. I think last year, if I'm not mistaken, that during the last 5 years in Malaysia, there have been 3 1-in-a-100-year flood events in Malaysia. One was in Selangor, one was in Baling, and one was in Johor during the last 5 years. And this 1-in-a-100-year event is not something that I say. These are official statements where, for many of you who are an expert in statistics, I'm not. I almost failed my statistical module. But it means that that kind of flood is not supposed to happen more than 1 time every 100 years. But 3 has happened during the last 5 years. So what this suggests is that the flood events, and I would argue not just in our country, but also in the region around the world, is becoming more severe and is becoming more frequent. And every time these climate events happen, people lose their lives, people lose their belongings, and economic infrastructure gets destroyed. And I think that part is very important because sometimes when we talk about climate change and we talk about deforestation, sometimes there are certain views that say, yes, but we have to provide employment through logging activities. That is also an aspect. But too much of that, I'm not here to say that logging shouldn't be done, but too much of that, you have flood, then billions gets destroyed. Those are also livelihoods, right? So it's always a balance there. But climate change is not just about flood, but it's also about heat wave and droughts. And last year, we read a lot of news about how people died of heat wave in this country. And this happened around the world. In Europe, hundreds or thousands of people die. We have wildfires. Those are the short-term, droughts and heat wave and also flood. But over the long term, we are talking about increase in sea level because of global warming. And unfortunately, a lot of our industrial and residential and commercial heartland are actually along the coast. Malaysia is not a very big country, but we have one of the longest coasts in many countries. So we are highly exposed to climate change. So earlier I talked about how at the regulatory and at the policy level, our country is taking a very clear direction on this. And this is a very important fact because when something becomes policy or regulation, then it cascades down to the industry. So for example, in the 12th Malaysia Plan, the government of Malaysia made a lot of references to the topic of sustainability in terms of sustainable development, human resource, and so on. But there is also another document called National Energy Transition Roadmap. Earlier when I talked about the plan is by 2050, 70% of our energy will be renewable, or that's the aim that comes from that document. And research, there have been many research to calculate what does it take to get our country towards that aim. And some organization estimate that more than 1.6 trillion ringgit worth of economic activities and investments will need to be deployed in order to reach that objective. So of course, when we talk about that amount of sum of investments and money, then it will have repercussions in terms of our industry, employment opportunities, and so on. So it's not just a policy document, it's changing. And talking about risks and opportunities, the risks and opportunities are not just at the professional, at the personal level, but also at the corporate level. For example, nowadays, we can see that how the European car industry are struggling against the Chinese car industry because of electric vehicles, right? That is an example where you have a country or a group of companies that can see where the direction is in terms of climate change, and they can see how it's going to impact the industry in terms of the electrification of the transportation sector and car, and decided to take that head on and say, look, we are going to develop our industry based on EV. And now, how you can see the legacy car companies are struggling with it. So the topic of risk and opportunity is actually two sides of the same coin. It is an opportunity if you take advantage of it. It is a risk if you ignore it. And that's happening at the societal level, at the organization level, and also at the personal level. So the rest I will not dive into the future, dive too much into it, but enough to say that at the regulatory, at the policy level, it is very strongly embedded, not just in our country, but in other countries as well. In Singapore, in EU, in UK, in Australia, in Japan, China, and so on. So now let's talk about our sustainability reporting landscape, because this part is very important to accountants. So of course, when you have a lot of ESG activities and strategy, the important part is also the reporting, just like the reporting of financial performance and position. So there have been a lot of movement, and not new, for the last few years and in the future. But the latest development that we have is on the introduction of NSRF, or National Sustainability Reporting Framework, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. But basically, it requires the adoption of IFRS sustainability standards on listed entities and also large non-listed companies. Based on our estimate, around 1,260 companies in Malaysia will be affected by this, and I will talk more about the rules. So this is a big deal because companies, at least these listed and large non-listed companies, now have to follow the regulation. It's not voluntary adoption, whether I want to voluntarily adopt IFRS sustainability standards and so on. It is a requirement. So in Malaysia, historically, there have been a lot of reporting framework being used. So you see words such as GRI, which stand for Global Reporting Initiative. So all of these acronyms, GRI, SDG, SASB, IIRC, and so on, these are just different framework that people use to report sustainability performance, sometimes separate to each other, sometimes in conjunction with each other. What do I mean? Some sustainability report is prepared on the basis of integrated reporting, but within it, they also say we want to comply with GRI, we want to comply with UN SDG and SASB and so on. So if we look in Malaysia, we can see that SDG and GRI is very high. I think the reason is UN SDG because it's a global framework. And also it's not really a reporting framework per se. UN SDG, the 17 colorful badges that I showed you earlier, simply shows 17 sustainable goals, but it doesn't actually say how you should report it. So relatively quite a simple adoption compared to a more full-blown framework like GRI and IFRS sustainability standards. But GRI is, on the other hand, is a full sustainability reporting framework. And listed companies in Malaysia traditionally have used GRI as a framework, partly because of it's been used for a long time. Bursa also made some references to GRI as part of good practices and so on. So GRI have been quite prominent in Malaysia, But now, I foresee a lot of listed companies will start or will have to use IFRS sustainability standards. So now let's talk about IFRS sustainability standards. So it's under the umbrella or the ambit of International Sustainability Standards Board. Actually, the interesting point was 2 of the board members actually came to Malaysia a few months ago. And myself and some of my colleagues from PwC and the industry, we had the privilege of meeting the board members just trying to understand the insight and the context behind it. So it's created by IFRS Foundation alongside International Accounting Standards Board, which issues the accounting standards. So it's under the same umbrella. And it takes into consideration various different standards and rules. For example, TCFD, SASB standards, integrated reporting, and so on. The intention of this IFRS sustainability standards is to serve as the new global baseline for reporting from now on, which is why they take a lot of references from others to harmonize some of these framework so that it can be used globally. Right? So it is these standards now for sustainability reporting. And within the IFRS sustainability standards, right now there are 2, but in the future there will be more than 2. It kind of like reminded me when, during my accounting student days, there was only like a number of accounting standards. Now there are too many. Sorry, apologies, not too many, there are so many. Semantic words are important. Same as sustainability standards, now there are 2, but there are probably more in the future. Now these 2 standards are IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. IFRS S1 serves as a conceptual framework that talk about the concept of faithful representation, that talk about the concept of relevance and the rest of it, just like how IFRS accounting standards, the conceptual framework. It also talks about 4 key elements or 4 key pillars of reporting, which is governance, strategy, risk management, and also metrics and targets, which I'm going to go deeper after this. And S2 is more like, if you will, a subject-specific standard. IFRS S2 talk about climate change or climate risk. So basically, IFRS S1 covers everything, all the ESG or sustainability issues that a company can think about. But when it comes to climate change, it's IFRS S2. But it's not one or the other, they both work in tandem. Now, one of the questions that I asked to the ISSB board members when they were in Malaysia is, why climate change as the S2? Why not cybersecurity? Why not labor rights? Why not a lot of other things? And what I was informed was that the process which ISSB took to issue, to select which subject to release, it's not based on what they think is important. It's not that they are applying their personal judgment on what's important for the industry. But they went through a rigorous process where they engage with the industry leaders, stakeholders, they use surveys, and basically, in substance, they ask this question: which of these key ESG issues that's likely to affect you as a commercial entity? And the answer that came out from the industry predominantly is climate change. And based on that, they say, okay, therefore, we have to issue a standard on climate change or climate risk because this is what the industry needs. So I thought that's interesting because it's not like they are trying to exercise their own personal morale on the industry. It is what the industry talk about. And the reason, as you learn more about climate change, it becomes apparent because climate change is not just about flood and droughts and also rising sea levels, but it can also be changes in regulations. So for example, in many jurisdictions, they apply carbon tax to penalize emission. That is a form of regulatory development or regulatory tool which can actually affect a company's viability or profitability. Another thing about, the very interesting thing about IFRS sustainability standards is the kind of lens they use, and this part is very important, on what's considered important or not important. So you see many other sustainability reporting standards, when they say disclose what you are doing on various issues, I'm oversimplifying, but basically the lens that it says is find out how you as a company or as an organization are affecting the people and environment around you. Are you causing the indigenous community a lot of harm? Are you hurting the sea, the marine life? Are you cutting down trees? Are you making the world hotter? That kind of thing. These are important things, but in the past, many sustainability reporting framework ask about, find out how you as a company are impacting the people, the community, the environment around you, and talk about how you're not doing too much damage, in simple words. But IFRS sustainability standards kind of flip it around and say, yes, all those issues are important, but we are going to ask a different question. It's more about how do those sustainability issues are affecting you as an organization in terms of financial performance, cash flow, and also your financial position, right? So it's not that it's different, but it's kind of like a different lens. So it's more like, if you have very poor health and safety records, and a lot of people go to hospital, in what way do you think you can be exposed to legal litigation and from your regulatory license being pulled back, or from your customers or supplier dropping you and therefore causing you to suffer financially? If you pollute the environment or you cause a lot of emission into the air, in what way in the future, if carbon tax comes to Malaysia and the price of carbon tax is like 10 ringgit per metric ton, that's just an example, in what way your financial cash flow will be affected? So the lens is more from the point of view of investors, from shareholders, from the banks, insurance companies. And there is a reason behind it. Basically, it's using financial transparency and capital market to reallocate economic resources from the companies that does bad to company that does good. So therefore, if a company are very careless and very irresponsible on these E, S, and G matters, poor health and safety record, pollute the environment, doesn't manage the waste properly, produce a lot of emission, very weak governance, based on this IFRS sustainability disclosure standards, you are going to see a lot of those issues getting highlighted, not just in terms of branding purposes, because sometimes people associate sustainability report as pictures of people recycling and planting trees. It's not that anymore. If a company does a lot of those things, then they're supposed to analyze in what way does it affect the company and in what way they can lose money. And a key part of IFRS sustainability standards is the financial effect or the financial quantification. It's not just pictures, it's not just what you are doing, it's how much are you getting exposed, which is a very big difference compared to other sustainability standards. I think that's the most important distinction. So within the topic of IFRS sustainability disclosure standards, it talks about 4 key pillars or dimension of reporting: governance, strategy, risk, and metrics and targets. Without going into too deep, some of these concepts are not new. Some have been used in many other frameworks. but some are very specific towards IFRS sustainability standards. Governance basically say, if you are adopting IFRS sustainability standards for your sustainability reporting, don't forget to talk about your governance oversight on sustainability matters. But those are just the principle, but there are many other specific rules. It talk about explain your board and management committee oversight and structure, talk about the board competence in managing sustainability issue or their competency framework. So there are a lot of things which IFRS SDS or Sustainability Disclosure Standards say that you have to explain. On the strategy, basically this is the bit that says, identify what are the issues. I mean, just now we saw under the ESG sustainability issues, there can be dozens of issues. Find out which issue that apply to you and explain in what way this poses a risk and opportunity to you and explain how you're managing it, right? So for example, that let's say a company say, we produce a lot of emission. If carbon tax comes in, and the government of Malaysia did say that it will come in the future, we just don't know when. If it comes in, it will affect us financially and therefore shareholders' value. What we are doing about it are a few things. Number one, we are going to reduce our emission by replacing our old machinery with new one. Why? Because the new machinery are more energy efficient, so therefore use less energy and less emission. Number two, we are going to use renewable energy. We're going to have a lot of solar panels because solar panels are cleaner compared to fossil fuel, right? There's no emission. Yes, if we want to get into technicality, emission into producing the solar panel, but by and large, in terms of operating the solar panel, no emission. And number three, we are going to go for low carbon emission products, as a matter of example. And we are going to talk about it in our report. So that's how, from a practical example, how a company, once they decide what are the important sustainability matters, sustainability issue that's relevant to their company, they're supposed to talk about the risk, how they're going to be affected. They're supposed to talk about the opportunities, and they're also supposed to talk how they're going to deal with it. The risk management is very interesting because, actually, as a matter of fact, this is how I actually got involved in ESG. I mean, I wasn't trained as a sustainability specialist. Like I mentioned, I was an accounting graduate. But as part of my profession, I studied the topic of risk a lot. I mean, my career, I've been involved in helping my clients strengthen their risk management framework and enhance their risk management capabilities. And within the topic of IFRS sustainability standards, the topic of risk management is super important. As a matter of fact, I personally would argue that it's probably one, if not the most important part of the standards, because the whole concept is anchored on the topic of you're not required to talk about everything, but assess which sustainability issue that pose you the most risk. So it starts with risk first. What are the sustainability risks and opportunities, or SROs? The concept of SROs is mentioned in the standards. What are those SROs that your company are exposed to, and build from there? So the topic of risk management is very important. Without a risk management or risk assessment process, to comply with this framework becomes very difficult or almost impossible, because a company is supposed to prioritize what are the key risks. And finally, metrics and targets. It is intuitive. I mean, of course, a company can talk about the strategy, the financial effect, what they're going to do, but without having a targets, then the whole thing becomes useless. So for example, many companies say, okay, we're going to reduce our emission by X percentage a year. We are going to reduce our energy usage by this amount much per year. In terms of waste management, we are going to recycle a certain percentage of our waste by this much a year. When it talks about health and safety, we are not going to tolerate more than X cases of health and safety cases a year. So targets are very important, KPI, as in everything else. So just now when I talk about the National Sustainability Reporting Framework. So just a bit of clarification. Sorry, I'm just looking at my watch because Economia is staring at me. There is a scale. Scale is accuracy and measurement. Be very punctual with time. And the difference between NSRF and IFRS SDS. Okay, maybe I'll give a bit of, spend a bit of time talking about the different acronym. Sometimes people say ISSB standards. Sometimes people say IFRS SDS, which stand for IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. But the word ISSB standards, because ISSB is the board that issue the standard, is also widely acceptable. So if you hear IFRS Sustainability Standards or IFRS SDS, or you hear ISSB standards, they are the same thing, right? It's those standards in IFRS S1 and S2. And NSRF, National Sustainability Reporting Framework, is a Malaysian framework. Only Malaysia has it. But NSRF is not a reporting framework. It doesn't talk about how you're supposed to disclose your sustainability performance. It is basically a framework which says that, in principle, Malaysia as a country, if you fall under these categories of companies, you are required by regulation to use IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. If you want to have voluntary adoption in other standards, fine, but at minimum you need to have IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. That is the regulatory requirement. And what NSRF say, okay, now that I've made it clear that all these companies have to use ISSB standards, these are the timeline. And which timeline do I use? Depending on which category of companies you are. There are 3 categories under the NSRF. If you are a large listed company, which is defined as listed issuers with market cap more than 2 billion, your category 1 starts in 2025. If you are less than 2 billion market cap, you start in 2026. And if you are listed in A's, or you're not listed but you are large, the definition of large is annual revenue more than 2 billion, you start in 2027. So the use of these 3 categories of companies is basically to prescribe by what time, by which year they're supposed to adopt. There are also some transition relief, which I'm not going to get into detail, but basically it talk about you can focus on climate first, you can focus on scope 1 and scope 2 of your greenhouse gas, not yet scope 3 transition relief, but those are the nuances. And it also talk about assurance requirements. So we're not yet sure right now. The Advisory Committee on Sustainability Reporting, or ACSR, is taking a lot of doing consultation with the industry, but basically we don't know yet whether is it going to be limited assurance or reasonable assurance. But basically, the NSRF framework put a timeline in terms of by when they expect assurance opinion to be issued. So if you are Group 1, for example, by 2027, remember Group 1, 2025, they are supposed to disclose. 2027, an assurance requirement is required, at least on the Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emission. But by 2030, assurance opinion on the whole framework, just like why right now we have assurance opinion on IFRS accounting standards, is assurance opinion on the whole usage of the sustainability reporting framework. So this is a big deal because not only it is a regulation, company have to disclose it, it's not a choice, but also it's subject to assurance opinion. So which is why just now when I say ESG, in particular climate change, is not going away, this is not a fad. This is not a trend. Labubu might be a trend. Sorry, I just learned about that word because my daughter kept talking about it. Kata benda apa labubu, labubu. Okay, so now I know. So expensive. This is not going away. It's part of regulation. It's going to be subject to assurance opinion. So, if you are to communicate to another person the importance of ESG, this is my last slide, by the way. There are many reasons why it's important. Probably the most important that all of us intuitively feel is the responsibility as a human being. But like I said, I'm not here to preach, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I'm going to talk about the practical matter to company, to industry, to individuals. Number one is global trend and stakeholder expectations. As part of my work, I engage a lot with senior management, with CEO, with board members. And all of them want to talk about, want to have conversation about sustainability. For multiple reasons. For their own personal belief, for regulations, fiduciary duty, and so on. And stakeholder is very broad. The other day, a client came to me and say, I don't know how to deal with my banks and insurance company. They are starting to ask me very unusual questions nowadays. I say, what do you mean? And he said, typically banks in the old days, whenever you want to borrow money from them, they ask very specific questions. How are you going to generate this money? When are you going to pay us back? What's your collateral? Who are your guarantor? Credit risk type of question. But now, many banks are asking that question, and on top of that, they ask, do you have net zero strategy? Do you have ESG framework? Do you have ESG targets? Is your governance framework aligned towards sustainability? And for the longest of time, this person couldn't understand why the banks were asking that kind of question. But I can tell you why. Part of the reason, not the entire reason, but part of the reason is regulations. Because Bank Negara Malaysia had issued a policy document called CRMSA, which stands for Climate Risk Management Scenario Analysis Framework, which requires all the entities which it regulates, banks, insurance companies, and so on, to assess the effect of climate risk on their business model. And how we can see from the regulations, it results in the financial sector conducting new due diligence which affect customer. So stakeholders here is not just shareholders, but also banks, insurance companies, all those things that companies depend on. Number two is regulatory alignment. So just now we talked about how it becomes important for listed companies and large non-listed companies. But how about if you're an SME? If you're not a listed company, then perhaps I don't have to follow, right? And I would argue the answer is wrong. Because if you look at the way these concepts are crafted, one of the key topics in IFRS sustainability standards is climate disclosure. When we talk about climate disclosure, you cannot run away from emission. When you talk about the emission, you cannot run away from greenhouse gas protocol. In fact, greenhouse gas protocol is mentioned in the standards. And the way that greenhouse gas protocol is designed, it cuts across the whole value chain. It's not just your own entity. So for example, a company produces a lot of emission through the electricity it uses. So for example, aircon, lights, and so on. This results in emission. That comes under scope 2. But there are also, within the GHG protocol, it talks about not only you have to count the emission that you produce, you also have to measure the emission across the supply chain, upstream and downstream. So if you have a building and you lease it to a customer, you have to count for that. If you produce a product and then you sell it to your customer, the emission associated with the recycling or the waste disposal of that comes to you. When your staff travel from home to work, the mode of their travel, whether it's by car, motorbike, EV, that's part of emission. When you take a business travel by aeroplane, that's part of emission. When you buy goods or machinery from your supplier, those machines do not exist by itself. There is a huge energy-intensive process to produce that machine. That is an emission, and you have to count it. So at first, it sounds a bit like illogical because the company say, I don't produce this machine, I just buy them. I don't use those buildings, I'm leasing that to my lessee. I mean, as a shareholder, I don't travel, my staff travel. But the way that greenhouse gas protocol is designed, it cuts across those value chain. Now, long story short, why is this story important? So if you're an SME, even if you're not a non-listed company, but you're part of the supply chain, which most companies are, you provide services to listed company, or your customer could be listed company, or your supplier could be listed company, you will be caught as well in one way or another. So that is an important part. So regulatory alignment, not just for listed entities, but it has an indirect repercussion for non-listed entities as well. Number 3 is reputation, brand, and market differentiation. I mean, of course, brand is very important. People like to say that they are very ESG aware nowadays. It looks great on their sustainability report. But it's not just about brand, but it's also about product and market differentiation. Earlier, I talked about how some legacy auto companies are struggling with the introduction of EV. So that is an example where a sustainability issue on the topic of climate change can affect an industry and create a product differentiation based on that. Now, it's not really product differentiation or business model because of ESG, but basically in the history of commercial entities, opportunities are created when new things or the landscape change. It has always been like that. So for example, when the economy moved from agricultural economy to industrial revolution, some companies goes bust, some companies that produce machinery flourish. When people start moving into information revolution, internet, many companies goes bust, a lot of new technology companies goes up. This is just another paradigm shift where the whole world is decarbonizing with significant changes to our industry. And as a result, this creates an opportunity and product differentiation opportunity and also risks. And finally, a strategic resilience and long-term value creation, because we are not just talking about ethics or morale, we are talking about long-term value creation and how dependent our economic activities is on nature, on climate, and on regulation. And as a result, this is why ESG is important. Now, even if a business owner doesn't believe in ESG, let's say you imagine a person who says, look, climate change does not happen, ESG is not important, whatever. This is a hypothetical example. The fact that the person feels that ESG is not important does not mean that these sustainability issues will not affect the company. It's as simple as that. So I think in a summary, those are the reasons why ESG are important. And I thought this part is interesting because very often it's usually approached from the perspective of moral responsibility and so on. Those are very important, of course, but there is also a very practical impact to it. And with that, I thank you very much for listening to me for the last 1 hour. I hope I've helped to produce some insight into the topic. And happy to take any question.
Assalamualaikum, I'm Fariza from UMT. I'd just like to ask, because I've taught some students about this IFRS and all that, but students tend to be like overwhelmed with all the information, additional information, apart from the normal, the standard, the basic standards, the basic knowledge. But then on top of this, you need to talk about the sustainability and all these. Coming into emissions, everything all that. So they become overwhelmed. Do you have any sort of like tips or, tips to how to reduce that overwhelming feeling from them? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Puan Fariza. My honest answer is, I struggle with it as well. I'm not here to say this is how exactly you do it, because you're, you deal a lot with students more than I do. But I have a bit of experience because I do mentoring, I do a lot of student engagement. It's not easy because you have many standards. But what I try to do is to highlight the perspective from how it can benefit them, and I try to create some context. And the context is the job market is very competitive. And if what you have is only a degree, you will be fighting with thousands or hundreds of thousands of other candidates. But if you understand this specific body of knowledge, it will make your life easier and you're going to benefit from it. Now, I'm not saying that it worked all the time. And I think part of the reason is biasalah, budak muda. I was also 17, 18 when I was before. When I was at that age, I don't think about career. It was like video game and friends and the rest of it. So, but we try. And that's how I try to communicate, to talk about the context. Not because you have to do it, because you have to save the world, but it will make your life easier.
Assalamualaikum and very good morning. I'm Zalaila from UMT as well. I would like to ask, from your experience, if the company wants to choose any issues to disclose in terms of sustainability, so how materials are how they set the materiality levels?
Yeah. Oh, very, very good question, Puan Zalaila. Based on the standards, it talks about, it explains what can be considered material for a company, but it's very principle-based. But basically it says, if that particular topic or the omission of that topic is likely to affect the decision-making capability of your stakeholders, and your stakeholders is your shareholders, investors, banks, and so on, then it's likely to be material. In a simple word, basically, that's what it says. So it's not prescriptive. It doesn't say there is a particular ratio, but it says that if you don't disclose it, the decision-making capability will be compromised. And I think in practical terms, which is why the IFRS sustainability standards put a lot on financial impact. Because you can say this topic is important or this topic is not important. People might say, I don't have to disclose this, my waste practices. I don't have to disclose my labor management practices because they are not that important. But if there have been history of regulatory fines on that particular issue, and that particular company is highly exposed to waste management and labor practices, then what one would say, you are missing out something important. So that's how it addresses it.
Okay, thank you very much for the enlightenment from your speech just now. I would be interested to ask a question regarding the CRMSA pertaining the bank's what you call practices with regard to the sustainability. How has this been incorporated in the banking sector among the bank players, and how that aligns with the standards like Basel III and also some of the reporting that might be relevant for the bank? That would be the question.
Thank you very much, sir, for the question. It's a highly technical question. I'm happy to have a conversation with you after this. But in general, what I see is there are a lot more institutionalization of the topic of climate change into the processes of the banks and insurance companies. So for example, as part of the due diligence process, many banks or all banks now have embedded specific processes to identify climate risk, either by the use of taxonomy or climate risk assessment. In terms of the reporting of performance, they also monitor the climate initiative conducted by their customers. In terms of financial risk management and stress tests, they also consider that as part of their stress test framework. So there are many others. So those are the things that I've seen. In terms of alignment to capital adequacy framework and so on, maybe we can have a chat after this, but it definitely have had a big impact on the banking industry. Thank you. Okay, so I think it's time now. So thank you very much again for your questions and for listening. If you want to reach out to me again in the future, I'm on LinkedIn under Nik Shahrizal, so I'll be more than happy to connect with you and to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.